Questions?
There are no really successful examples anywhere in the world of large-scale urban renewals in declining economies. The ones that do operate successfully are ones when the economy is getting better rather than getting worse. I'm not sure whether anybody has suggested an alternative for declining economies.
Yeah, the problem is enormous. Correct me if I'm wrong, but about 80% of Montrealers will never be able to afford the cheapest condominiums on the market today. So the gap between what we produce, we don't produce any housing, any rental housing at all, except for with a few handful of little tiny programs. I mean, there are 200,000 households in the Montreal region, according to the CMM, the regional government, if you want. 200,000 households who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing, so are technically in core need. And of those, about 120, I think it's 120 or maybe 130,000 are paying more than 50% of their income. Okay, so these are households in deep core need in housing, right? So we have a huge problem.
Canada has a long history of doing mixed income housing projects and making them work relatively well. The difference compared to the 1970s and early 1980s is that the income range in places like the Regent Park redevelopment, for example, the income gap is much larger than it was between the middle-class housing that was built in Falls Creek in Vancouver and the co-ops. And all the research shows that the wider the income gap, the more difficult it is to make the mixed income work without tensions.
I'd love to hear some solutions. I'm all ears.
Okay. Solutions, okay.
Solutions to this, I mean, I don't think that studying the history of urban planning, makes a person able to provide solutions any better than anyone else, and so I sort of really love to hear what other people are the solutions, because it's ultimately not going to be a solution about a different design for housing or a different housing policy on its own, although better housing design and better housing policy is good, but I mean I think the solution would have something to do with a large-scale movement to change society, and that has a lot to do with what people are willing to fight for.
Is the film, in bringing this the problem of segregation up in regards to public housing, is that a factor in its failure, or is there also something within the design of these large-scale institutions that has correctly been identified as being out of scale and patriarchal?
It's really hard to answer that without falling into the analysis that's been propagated over 30 years. I mean, I think the point that the film makes really well is that we need to see housing within a larger social context. And so to talk about design in an abstraction from the social context, which determines whether people have a job or whether they're treated fairly by the police, et cetera, is really difficult to discuss. So I think I'm going to disappoint you on my answer for that, which is that I don't really have an answer about that. Certainly we can quibble with the design of these large-scale projects, but they fail because they concentrate poverty in a society that has a lot of poverty. If you had a different kind of situation, maybe that kind of building would be totally utopian and wonderful.
I'm just wondering what is most advantageous for poor people, because it seems like socioeconomic diversity would be a positive thing for everybody, but is there a way of allowing that to happen without the neighborhood becoming too exclusive, economically speaking?
How to allow a little bit of gentrification without people being displaced? It's the perennial question. There is no answer to it. There are people who would say you shouldn't even allow a little bit of gentrification because you can never have just a little bit of gentrification. Once it starts, it's unstoppable. The mechanisms to control gentrification do exist, but it costs money. And it involves public policy, again, to create stable, affordable housing that cannot be brought back into the private rental market and allowed to inflate. But it also involves something else which is more difficult to control, which is making sure that commercial services, shops, don't get transformed so that the little old lady no longer recognizes the butcher. She doesn't feel comfortable going into this little restaurant because it's not the same place as before. It's also about cultural comfort. And those things are a lot more difficult to control just by money.
I'm curious about how to promote mixed incomes. I lived in an area between the Gay Village and Parc La Fontaine, and it seemed, while being a sketchy place, I would also found it really weird walking around that there were just these condos, like 3-story condo buildings in this place that I didn't really feel safe in. So I was wondering how it happens, really.
From the qualitative research that I did a few years ago, there are different kinds of reactions to that. One we could call maybe condo metro dodo, where people live in a bubble and they don't really get involved with what's going on in their neighborhood, and they get their car out of their underground garage and they drive and they go somewhere else and then they come back to sleep. Another reaction could be people getting very involved in trying to push marginal people out of their neighborhoods. But I want to follow that up by saying it's not only residents of condos who are trying to push the homeless and push sex workers out of central Montreal neighborhoods. It's very often people in ordinary working class neighborhoods who are just as active in those movements to exclude the marginal people from streets.
Certainly in Vancouver, one of the things you find is that profit making in development, in developing condos, it can often be very high where the surrounding housing stock the price is very low. And so in Vancouver, you often find a firm line between a very poor neighborhood and a very wealthy neighborhood, because if you can build a condo in a poor neighborhood and get people to buy it, you can make a lot more money than if you build it in a wealthier neighborhood. And so I'm not sure whether that logic is circulating within the minds of developers in Montreal. I pretty much assume that it is, and that's one reason amongst a bunch of others that you do find this very, and I agree with you, that's a strange thing to see, but I think it makes a lot of economic sense.
The question that I have is that you mentioned that there's no national housing policy, but I'm wondering kind of in maybe Toronto and Montreal what the policy is for social housing now, because I know in Regent Park when they're taking apart, they've put that new co-op on 40 Richmond East, and so I'm wondering how that, what the policy is that facilitated that transition from Regent Park to rehousing some of those people in this new co-op, or if there is a policy, or if that's a one-time thing, or what's going on there.
There was money to rehouse some people off-site in co-ops. Quite a large percentage of people majority of people were offered housing on site, some were offered housing off-site, and some people were not rehoused. There was all kinds of a bricolage of funding available.
The notion that in order to prevent damaging gentrification, we have to prevent any upward fluctuation in housing prices in an area seems to me to lead to a kind of static city, which is as utopian and fanciful, in my opinion, as the PRUITT-IGOE project. It's a city that can't change. It's not allowed to. And I'm all for mixed incomes, I really am, but how do we go about preventing this from becoming, leading to stagnation and the inflexibility of urban neighborhoods?
Yeah, I agree that it would be utopian and really unimaginary to think of a city that didn't change. What I'm concerned with, and what I think that this film helps to highlight, is that we live in a society, and we have for a long time, where people are moving, but privileged people are moving when they want to move, where they want to move, and so it's my choice if I want to gentrify a neighborhood, but the people who are going to be moved out don't have a choice, and you see this in a large stretch of time in this film where people are forced to leave the South, they move to northern cities, And then they're thrown into, they're living in slums, and then they're moved out of the slums and put into public housing, and then the public housing is torn down, and then they're thrown somewhere else. And so what we have is a situation where some people can move when they want to, and another group of people have to move when other people tell them to. And so I'm very much in favor of a city that changes, but I'm very much against this situation. And I think that it's possible to create a society where that movement and that choice about moving is a little bit distributed a little bit more equally.